Welcome back to the Vision for 2020 conference with Cath Knibbs, and this time we're able to ask Cath Knibbs all our questions around cyber trauma, online harms, cybersecurity, maybe even the GDPR, because some of my people are from England who train with me. There'll be all sorts of questions like that too, and I've got some FAQs, frequently asked questions, that I'd love to ask Cath. I'm sure Julie, who's on live, and there's other people who are going to be listening back to this, like, you know, whether anywhere else we end up putting this, there'll be lots of questions for you, I think, in the future as well, and this might even help you kind of gauge where therapists are at the moment. So I'm going to kind of hand over to you, Cath, just to kind of introduce yourself and just give us a bit of a, a few summaries about these types of things, if that's okay.
Well, I mean, I'm absolutely rubbish at introducing myself, so I tend to skip. That's why I put it onto a slide, you see. So if you really want to know about me, go back and watch my introduction, because I'm just rubbish at this egocentric, I do this, I do that, I've done this. It just doesn't feel comfortable, which is my own stuff I've got to deal with, and I know that. But what I was thinking actually is there's a couple of things. So one of the aspects I didn't really get round to in the talk was this idea of where we're currently at in terms of what I'm calling the overclocking of information. So we might talk about that in a second. But I would say that I'm absolutely buzzing from Richard's masterclass just now. In terms of where I've been heading is certainly non-linear, to use Richard's language from a minute ago. But what I've been doing is moving into this space, which is completely new. It's unknown, it's uncharted territory. We've got lots and lots of things happening within this space, and as a species, we haven't known how to understand this. Given that our brains are developed, if you like, for this corporeal world, we've suddenly got this virtual world where the rules don't apply. We can behave in lots of different ways that didn't seem to fit beforehand. There's an enormous amount of information which we can't make sense of. So I kind of wanted to talk to that for a minute in terms of lots of therapists are currently at home working online because of this pandemic, epidemic. It will then become an endemic. We've got the fact that this is now in our lives, that we can be sabotaged by something that we can't see. And for me, there's a parallel in terms of the virtual world and this virus, that they have a similar concept in the way that we understand the world. So pretty much the therapists, the clients, we're all discussing this thing that none of us can see. And of course, my research is in and around the virtual world. And when I'm trying to describe it to somebody, and I say during the training something along the lines of, how big is cyberspace? How much does it weigh? You can see that people can't grasp what we call hypothetical constructs, because the brain just isn't very good at that. The brain's not particularly great at estimating and imagining the number of stars in the universe. So when we talk about brains, we tend to do this, don't we? We say, oh, there's 10 billion neurons, there's 100 trillion glial cells, there's, more connections possible within this system. And you can see people going, yeah, I can't get an image of that in my head. We can't imagine ourselves in 6 months' time, in a year's time, in 10 years' time. So a lot of this, which actually brings me back to that point about Richard and the conversation that you had about coaching, about visualize yourself in a year's time. Yet we're not very good at that, which is why it doesn't work for a lot of people. So this virtual space is currently bombarding us with, and I'm going to use a metaphor that I've heard used by a few other people, which is we're drinking out of a fire hose that's on full whack. We just don't have the capacity in terms of our brain development at this stage in time to understand, to filter, to facilitate the sense making And I think we're currently all at the edge of our tolerance levels. We're at the edge of our sense making. We're at the edge of our patience for a lot of us. And of course, one of the things we can't do at the moment, and this is one of the frustrations I have as a therapist, is I work with children, I work with trauma. Whatever that trauma might be, that trauma is the space of, discombobulation, unknown. People are looking for the familiar. They're looking for some form of conformity, and they're looking for an outcome that makes sense. And of course, as a therapist, I'm saying, well, yeah, we can meet online next week, but we could be in the office. No, we're not in the office. We're going to be meeting walk and talk. No, we're not going to do walk and talk. We're going to be back online. Oh, yeah, I can't do online today because there's I don't know, something's happening in my house. I've got a workman, so we'll have to do it on the phone. And for me, there's a huge issue in terms of what we're actually providing stability wise for our clients. So for those of us that have worked online, we're quite used to working online, and we've done this for a while and we know how it works. And what I've noticed is the people that came to me for online therapy before COVID were people who said, yep, I have a Tuesday afternoon off or a Thursday morning. I'd like to use that time to talk to you online because I'm in a safe space. I'm not going to be interrupted. It's a time that's convenient for me. And of course, right now, we're also picking times where it's not convenient. The rest of the house is there because everybody's in lockdown. And people are struggling to understand their boundaries, their time limits. Conversations that I have in therapy at this point in time, which reflect that sense making, are, what do you think about the vaccines, Cath? What do you think about the information that's out there? And I know that there's a lot of us having these conversations about where is the truth, where's the edge of truth, what's a lie, what's reliable, who's telling the truth, how do we know that they're telling the truth, where does that originate from, how do we sense make about that? And I just don't have the time, in terms of as a person, not just a therapist or a researcher, to go and back check every single story that's presented. And of course, I do get lots of people sending me information about, have you seen this, Cath? I get it on Instagram from my friends saying, oh my God, there's a new thing about the vaccines here. What do you think to this, Cath? Which ones? And in the UK at the minute, we've got a couple of vaccines that are presenting themselves as, one is 70% effective, one is 90% effective, one can prevent COVID, one will help in the reduction of COVID symptoms. What do we do? What do I do when a client comes to me and says, what do you think, Cath? What's your opinion on how to make sense of this, and where the best option for me might be going forward? What's the best for me to do? And of course, as a therapist, as a researcher, I'm sitting there going, I don't know. And I'm noticing there's not a lot of people owning up to this not knowing. So I'm just finding that this overload of information has resulted in, a worldwide phenomena of, I don't know. I don't think any of us know at this point in time. And when I've been asked to talk about the online harm stuff, and people are saying, well, what do I tell my child? I'm actually saying, model, I don't know, because I think we all need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. I think we need to move to a space where being uncomfortable means you don't necessarily have those answers. And that means that we're going to have to lean into discomfort. We're going to have to lean into what's coming is going to be new to us. What's coming is, it's growing up. That's essentially what we're doing. We're growing up in a digital world. And within this digital world, there is so much information that doesn't make sense that none of us are there to know. So that's the first part that I'm going to kind of talk to, in terms of, have you got any questions about that? And what might they be in terms of, how do we make sense of this?
I actually have a question, and I know it's something I brought to you personally.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a little bit of a rabbit hole, but it kind of relates to some of the other stuff you were just referring to, but something entirely different. And it was quite shocking when I came across, and I think this is hashtag trigger warning, some really harsh cyber trauma stuff that happened to be on Facebook, and I brought it to your attention, and then putting a claim out that the UK cops needed to be involved. So I won't go into detail because I think it's not appropriate now. But I guess my question about that is then that then the outcome for me, I then became traumatized by the outcome, not by the fact that that stuff actually existed. And the fact that the law enforcement doesn't have the resources or the capacity to deal with complexity to the standards that need to be actually newly now adhered to when there's nothing there. It feels like we are almost sitting on this edge of a precipice about all of us about all to fall in on a cyber level if you can't even adequately deal with something from a law enforcement level that is clearly unacceptable.
Okay,
what do you think about that?
Yeah, so I'll talk to that in two ways. Excuse me. So first of all, we've got the cyber trauma itself, which so I did that blog on the biggest cyber trauma to date was the discussion of the pandemic and the way that happened, and the influx of information, the distressing news, the speed at which it happened. That actually what we're talking about there is this idea of free speech. So I'm going to kind of allude to the fact that this is what we're discussing in cyberspace at the moment, that there's this idea, and I'm going to call it this construct of free speech. And what does that actually mean? And what does that relate to in terms of the things that happen in cyberspace? So again, like you, I'm not going to go into what you actually sent me, but I will allude to a similar kind of situation so that people can understand it. So what's basically happened is this arena of cyberspace has resulted in people saying, I have the right and freedom to say what I want, to share what I want, and in doing so, not really caring about the impact on others. So in the real world, we would certainly not be stood like the town crier going, hear ye, I'm now going to tell you what I think about da-da-da-da-da. Because what often happens is law enforcement will come and say, you can't say that, you can't do that. There are etiquettes, there are rules about the whole world that we have to abide by. Now, in this digital space, this cyberspace, what is currently happening is news authorities, I'm just going to have to run to the door because there's a parcel. I'll be back in a second.
Okay, all good. So it's interesting, just for those of you still listening in. This is the interesting thing about cyberspace. Things happen in our homes now. It almost reflects. Art imitates life, Cath. Art imitates life.
There we are. That's life, isn't it? Anyway.
Yep.
So
keep going with what you were saying.
Back to so in this digital space, people have decided they have a platform, a space in which to say or do whatever they feel pleases them. Now, what that actually means is that people's ideas, fetishes, fantasies with a PH are spoken about, are talked about, are acted out within that space. And of course, in the corporeal world, what we think, what we're thinking about something, what we fetishize about, fantasize about, they're all within here, and nobody else is privy to that information. But go to the digital space, and whatever thought has ever been thunk exists. So of course you can happen upon people's ideas, people's thoughts, people's memories, people's traumas, people's fantasies. There's just everything that's available. And one of the things I'm seeing is that the more followers people get, the bigger their audience becomes, the more they feel that they are allowed, privileged, to say whatever they want. And of course, this then means that people like you and I, and when you happened upon something in that space, you kind of sent me it and said, is this allowed? You know, look at what this person's doing. Is this really allowed? And to date, having a how do I put this so that we don't really talk about it too deeply? Okay, having a penchant for something. I just want to call it that. Like having an idea about something that you would like to do to an other person that isn't legal within many countries is effectively you're allowed to be that kind of person. So if I say for a moment the idea of perpetrators of child crimes, so perpetrators of crimes against children, child sexual abuse, having those thoughts isn't illegal, but acting them out is. Okay, so in cyberspace, thinking about those things wouldn't be traceable, but actually if you're beginning to move into a space where you're acting it out, then it becomes illegal. And right now, the biggest issue that a lot of young people face in terms of that online space is the fact that there are perpetrators of crimes against children in whatever aspect that might be. So, of course, crimes against humans, crimes against sentient beings are also within that space. And of course, that's alluding to a little bit about what we talked about and what was sent. But the fact is, cyberspace can't be policed. It's an unregulated space. When the internet first began in 1996, we didn't have any rules about what could and couldn't happen there. And as a result, it's delineated into everything that a human can think about now exists. A third of the internet is pornography. And that doesn't include child sexual abuse images, because I'm certainly with this framework of we don't call it child pornography. It is not child pornography, it's child sexual abuse. And that actually, that's a third of the internet of adults having sex in whatever way it is. But then we've also got the other areas that most of us don't frequent. But actually, nowadays, you can find a lot of these issues on your social media feed. You can find them on a lot of social media platforms. And
as we knew, sorry to
yeah,
interrupt, as I was just on Facebook, just going to name the platform, but so this is the thing. These things are now moving into so I was
commonplace.
thinking,
Yeah.
thankfully my 15-year-old's not on Facebook at the moment, she's on Instagram, but not that makes any difference. These things are on all of these platforms, and I'm aware of it, but therapists need to be aware of this.
Well, I mean, number one, Renee, that's why I'm doing my online harms and cyber trauma training, to actually educate therapists as to the kinds of issues that you will be seeing in your therapy room. And if I explain the whole day's training, there's a lot of philosophy and theory about why we do what we do online, because you need to understand that about the rules that exist in the corporeal world are completely different but very similar and the same online. And it's a space that many people, I know that at the end of my courses, people come away going, oh my God, I didn't know that happened. I didn't even know that was possible in that space. I didn't know. And there's a lot of I didn't know at the end of the day's training. But, I've been doing this for over a decade. There's a lot of conversations that when people say to me, did you know this existed? Yes, I know that existed. And the depravity to which a human can think about or behave is on, the internet. And one of the things is it's becoming more mainstream. It's becoming more prevalent in that everyday space. So within the United Kingdom, we've got something moving forward called the Online Harms Bill. Now, that's meant to protect people from online harms, but it's very specific in how it's being put forward, and it isn't going to cover those areas that we will see as therapists within the therapy room. For example, what happens a lot of times in terms of free speech, if I think about this and give the example that I was going to allude to, that I have seen a case where a young black girl made a comment on a social media platform. It was disliked by other people. Of course it was, because, you know, in social media, nobody agrees, in terms of there's always going to be somebody who says, I disagree. It then moved into a space where she was sent racial slurs, she received death threats. People were actually following some of those death threats up in terms of, in the real world, turning up and putting things through her doorway and saying, you know, by the way, I'm so and so, so and so online. She went to the police, and one of the things that the police are struggling with at the moment is, number one, how do we classify what's online and what's corporeal? How do we actually say that's a crime that's virtual or that's a crime that's real? So, you know, stalking in the real world, you would have evidence that somebody had, I don't know, been in your car, been in your house, been at your office. How do you then bring that kind of evidence in terms of virtual world?
Oh, oh,
And
and then that leads down to another question, because this is kind of like even just having a conversation around this right now. I had a client in the corporeal world, because I still see clients in the
mm,
corporeal world as well as online. She was struggling with a partner who was tracking her, and won't go into any of the details, but
mhm,
obviously, you know, and the thing is, these these tracking apps with COVID, I'm very, very concerned about them.
mhm,
And what about our privacy? I have decided I am not downloading that, for all of the reasons that you talk to. But people clearly aren't realizing the link, that then, you know, there can be more chance of tracking if you're in a DV relationship. If you've downloaded that, then it opens you up for potential. Do you get what I'm saying?
yeah, yeah. So in terms of that young black girl, one of the things that didn't happen for her was a police investigation, because, as they said, you know, well, we can't go tracing everybody on the internet. We don't know their IP addresses. It's too much manpower. You know, we don't have the resources. And currently, that's what we're sitting with in terms of why things don't get traced, tracked, investigated by law enforcement. And then conversely, what we've got on the other side, and I'm going to talk about actually this is not a young person's issue. I worked with a client who was in his 50s, and he'd got a relationship which he didn't feel very comfortable in. And of course, that's what we were going to be working on in the therapeutic relationship. And one of the things he did was put a tracker on his girlfriend's car. He then downloaded trackable software onto her phone. So, you know, we had a conversation about that's an invasion of privacy, misuse of Computer Act. Of course, I know this because this is my background. But in today's society, I'm not sure that many therapists understand the law around technology, know the kinds of things that can happen. And if we take it to a young person's issue, one of the things that's very prevalent at this point in time is there are tracking devices that can be used in terms of coercive relationships. There are tracking devices that often get used when exploitation is happening, particularly when there's domestic abuse. Some of those tracking apps can hide what a child is doing online so the parents don't know. And technology is providing us with layers and layers and layers of complexity. And of course, when a client comes to talk to us, do we have that knowledge to be able to ask those questions, to inquire about that space, that place and time? Because what I actually find at the minute is, you know, I worked some time ago with a young girl who was groomed online, and within the first session, I'd established that there was numerous perpetrators. I went and spoke to the father. We got an investigation going, and we actually got the police involved, which turned out to be a bit of a mess because, unfortunately, due to manpower, they couldn't do what they needed to. But previous to that child coming to me, another therapist had been talking to her and had said, so the report arrived when I started to see this young lady, and it said something along the lines of, you know, she's been nattering away with her friends online, and given the relationship with her parents isn't so great, I think it's fantastic that she can talk to these people online and that they're providing her with a space that's supportive. It actually turned out that for 6 months prior to coming to my office, these friends that she'd been talking to online were actually grooming her. They were males, adult males from around the world, and she'd been groomed for over 6 months. The level at which it had got to was quite macabre. And of course, this other therapist hadn't been aware of how to ask questions or to discuss online life and what that actually meant, but didn't also understand the concept of how the online world works. And and I'm privileged insofar as my background, my the way that I think is very much like Richard alluded to in terms of systems theory, and I do a lot of kind of logical. Well, if that, then this. Well, what about that? And have you thought about this? And so there's a lot about exploring and curiosity into that online space, rather than I don't understand it, I'm not going to ask the questions, which is what I'm finding has happened in terms of it's too scary. Adults will say much of the time on the training and when I'm working with parents, oh, that's that kids understand technology. I don't. They're much better at it than I am. Well, actually, we're the adults of the world, and the wisdom and knowledge we hold about life is much more complex than the children. So actually, we do know more than them. And it's this environment that we don't understand because we haven't put ourselves in a position of curiosity to go and explore it.
Yeah, absolutely. But yet the kids have, and they've gone to explore it often, even more than their parents have, and hence then they're open to
Mm,
suggestibility and also potentially be trapped, but they don't realize that that might be the case because they don't have the wisdom of life experience too. Um,
yeah,
there's a question that
I I
Julie
can see
has.
it.
Um,
So
so what are your thoughts?
So, questions that I ask children, Julie. One of the things that's coming out of a lot of the training that I've done and the book that I'm writing at the moment is there is currently no help out there for us therapists or social workers or teachers to know the kinds of questions to ask. So I'm currently putting a guide together that will provide people with that space to. So, for example, asking a child how they're doing is one of the things. So working with children who come into my therapy room, every week it's, hi, come on in. This is before COVID, obviously. Hi, come on in. How are you doing this week? What have you been up to? And the what have you been up to doesn't necessarily apply to the school life. It doesn't necessarily apply to home life. It's about how is everything. And then I will ask questions about, so what have you been watching on Netflix? What games have you been playing recently? What have you been doing at school? What subjects? And I really kind of blend it into, I'm not specifically asking about the online world, but you must, and this is not a critical parent kind of pointy finger thing. There is now, and it's coming out of the e-safety world. And obviously I spend a lot of time in the e-safety world writing for a lot of companies and discussing with the organization I'm with. We must now ask questions about what they do in their digital life, but not to say, what do you do online? Because young people don't see the difference. There isn't an online, there isn't an offline. Who are your friends can mean at school, at home, online. So when you're asking these questions, it's about acknowledging that that space exists for a child, and it goes like that Venn diagram that I showed. It goes corporeal all the way through to virtual and back again. Who are they talking to? What are they doing? If they're online, what are they doing online? Who do they talk to? How do they talk to them? What games do they play? What do they do in those games? For example, are they on Fortnite? If they're on Fortnite, what skins have they bought? So there's an acknowledgement about the curiosity about what are you wearing as your avatar,
So you're
because that
you're also talking to cultural competence in the online space then.
Yeah. And you know, knowing that, so the way that I actually found out my client was being groomed, and quite often people struggled with how I got to where I got to just by the very first question that I asked, which was, what does your avatar wear? And she said, oh, a t-shirt that says vegan. By that point, my little red flags was going, okay, now I need to ask the next question. Now I need to ask the next question. And it was to do with, this was a young child who's classified as vulnerable in terms of the legal standing. So that would be a child with special education needs, learning difficulties, in the looked after system, or potentially with some sort of disability. So that they're classed as vulnerable in legal terms. As far as I'm concerned, when you're online, everybody's vulnerable. And you're vulnerable to attacks, you know, people stealing your data breach. There's all sorts of vulnerabilities online. But for a young child to be wearing a t-shirt, so this is what I'd done and asked, a t-shirt that said vegan, that now meant that people would either do one of two things. They'd either talk to her about being a vegan, or they would do something about them not being a vegan. So you can see that, you know, veganism does tend to push people in terms of it's a very interesting conversation, isn't it? Vegans will tell you they're vegans, and then people who are not vegans will kind of speak to them and say, well, I'm not vegan, you know. And of course, a young child who's displaying her dietary choices, you know, aged 11, 12, 13, is almost saying to people, come and have a conversation with me about my dietary choices. Because that's what we do in social media space. We make our profile picture something for people to talk about. We make our avatar something that people will notice. It's either popular, unpopular. We pick something that's geeky. We pick something that's kind of fringe, to talk to what Richard talked about earlier. And of course, when I then spoke to her about veganism, I then said, okay, and what happens when you're in this space and people come to talk to you about being a vegan? She said, well, I tell them that I'm depressed. And I went, okay, now the second red flag is telling me that now she's having conversations with people and telling them that she's depressed. And that led to, who are you talking to? What do they talk to you about? You know, who are your friends? And there was this misconception that these friends were also of her age, and it turns out that they weren't. So it didn't take me long from asking one question about a t-shirt all the way through to finding out that there was 5 or 6 perpetrators of sexual abuse.
How did you find out in the end that they weren't her age? That's a really important thing for everyone to hear.
So,
like, 'cause some of those questions, you know, kind of, you can potentially follow them through, you know, on some level, but it's like, how do you get to the bottom of the fact that, okay, so yep, that makes sense even to me, and probably even to a lot of people listening in as well. But it's more just about, how do you then find out that they're not people of her age?
So within this country, we have some case laws called Gillett competency and Fraser competency, which are a way of establishing whether a child, usually of about the age of 13 or 14, or around about that age, is competent enough to make decisions about their health, their well-being, and their, you know, basically their choices. And in this country, obviously, around about 13, 14, we're talking about privacy rights versus parental rights and safeguarding. So what I actually did with this family was have a conversation about putting some software onto this child's computer so that we could establish who those people were. Mainly because she used a gaming platform, a gaming app, something else and something else. So it was going to be what I call multimodal, multi-platform. So what we needed was something that could do an investigation, if you like, and capture some of that information to take to the police. What we actually did was put something called a key logger on. So there are pieces of software that will pick up on certain phrases, certain words. There's software that will monitor everything. And more often than not, businesses use key loggers, coercive relationships use key loggers. And of course, we were using it in the parental safeguarding perspective. And based on the age of the child, you know, I had a conversation with the parents and said, okay, I deem that she is not competent enough to make these choices because these people have already convinced her that what she's doing online, and I'm not going to go into the kind of macabre end of it, but what she is doing is normal behavior. And it isn't. It was actually, it was deep crime behavior. So that software picked up, I mean, the dad installed it, I think it was that evening. And then about 2 days later, he said to me, it's picked up 5 males from around the country who are sending her child sexual abuse images, they were sending her pornography, they were sending her lots of things that were really quite macabre. So at that point, we went to the police and said, this child is now a victim of child sexual exploitation, child grooming, and obviously adult to child crime. So in that instance, we used a keylogger. If a child was 13 or 14 in this country, in the UK, we'd be on kind of difficult landscape in whether we could do that or not. You know,
interesting. It's different here. We don't have the GILIC competency. I had heard of that. We don't have that here. In fact, we'd probably be able to do it till about the age of 16.
Yeah. So I mean, we do have laws like safeguarding children. You know, the Department for Education brought one out that says, you know, safeguarding trumps confidentiality. But we're in a very difficult space about when do we invade the privacy of somebody in order to collect evidence. And of course, that conversation that we had about the person on Facebook was, you know, what do we do with that evidence? When that was actually reported to the platform and to the police, they removed the initial account and he just started a new one up. So I don't know if you noticed that after the reporting of that account, he actually changed
I reported it. You reported it, and then he just started a new account. I had heard that. Yep.
So, but changed the name of it, and this is one of the things that's happening at this point in time with the cancel culture, is the idea of people being able to say what they want in terms of free speech, but then also people then getting that removed from the cyberspace, and also what that means for people in terms of, okay, so, and I'm going to come from a position here which is going to talk TA in terms of I'm okay, he's okay. I don't necessarily believe that he was who he said he was. I think it was I think it was a bit of a drama that he was creating, but also there's this, where do we get the entitlement? Do we have the entitlement to say what he thinks and believes is not okay? And in that case, do we come as part of the cancel culture? Or, as in this case, it was about protecting children and protecting, you know, other people from serious macabre crimes.
Yeah, this is, you know, it's just interesting. Yeah, I know what you're talking about regarding cancel culture too, but I think maybe because a lot of people listening back, and even Julie, might not be aware of what that actually means. Can you just clarify the definition? Because I'm cool, but I feel like for those people listening,
cancel culture. Yeah. So, well, cancel culture, as it's framed at the minute, it's a new phenomena where people will. So let's take Joe Rogan. In fact, most people will know Joe Rogan now has the biggest podcast within the world, pretty much. He started off as part of something called the intellectual dark web in terms of what he was doing for the conversations that he was having. He was bringing on guests onto his podcast where he would disagree with people. He'd bring on far left, far right, you know, those polarities of opinions. And what he would do was interview somebody and almost get to know the conversations that he struggled with. And in doing so, that then provided people with a very balanced level of interviews at which they could go and watch and listen to and, you know, take part in. And as a result, he became very popular. He was on YouTube. And then he moved over to Spotify. And in doing so, as he moved over to Spotify, some of the Spotify employees said, no, you need to make sure that he doesn't bring that episode over because we disagree with that one. And we don't like that episode. So what you need to do is you need to remove that. And he said something on this podcast that we think's absolutely abhorrent. You need to cancel that show, and you need to cancel this and cancel that. Years ago, this was known as deplatforming. So if you went to a conference and, you know, somebody was due to speak and another, I don't know, there was politics involved and somebody disliked the speaker that was due, they could actually deplatform somebody and prevent them speaking at a conference or an event before they actually did that.
That's happened to me.
So effectively, what's deplatforming in the real world, the corporeal, has actually transitioned online. And there is now this outrage and outcry, usually from a polarized position, to deplatform, to cancel what's happening. And cancel culture has actually become something that the platforms themselves are now engaging in terms of demonetizing particular aspects.
Yep.
I've had a number of YouTube videos restricted.
Yeah.
Mainly because I mentioned how to be. So I did a podcast interview with the UK version of HeartMath. I happen to know the person, so we did this interview. We talked about how to build resilience and coherence, and
right.
And because I mentioned COVID in the interview and on the title, I've had that restricted. I've been. I mean, I'm not at Joe Rogan's level, so you know the demonetization hasn't affected me whatsoever.
Yep.
But I've had things restricted in terms of the e-safety advice that I've given out with people, that we've talked about how to protect children from certain issues. And this cancel culture has resulted in YouTube platforms saying our algorithm thinks this, so they've deleted people off the platform. It's happened on Spotify, it's happened on iTunes, it's happened on basically any and every platform that exists. Instagram, people have had their accounts deleted. I've recently seen that people have had their Facebook accounts deleted. Facebook will now fact check and delete posts.
They've done that to me. I've had that happen on Facebook. Yep.
So this cancel culture has become an idea of, it's my race course, you can't come onto it. So, you know, what we're actually finding at the minute is, when it comes, and this goes right the way back to what we talked at the beginning, how on earth do we and our clients make sense of what's happening in this space when we are not privy to the entire debate or argument?
Exactly.
We don't get the full spectrum of the information. We are getting very limited viewpoints. And of course, this is happening over in the US at the moment, in terms of, have the elections been rigged? Haven't they? Is Joe Biden this? Is Trump this? We've had arguments at the last election about the manipulation of data. Right now, we've got in the UK and, you know, and in Australia, the rules about COVID, which utterly do not make sense, because, you know, the idea of, and I think we all know this. I think there's an element of common sense that's coming through from all of us as well, in terms of, I can wear a mask to walk through a room, to sit down at a table, and when I sit down at the table, I can take my mask off. And of course, in this country at the moment, and I joke about this in terms of, so children can go to school, but people can't go to work. So clearly, the virus must look at a school uniform and go, oh, can't
that's it.
that person.
That's it. I have a girlfriend, on that note, I have a girlfriend who was teaching dancing, and she couldn't keep teaching dancing, but she could teach at a school with 30 kids at the school, in 30 kids in the class, versus 6 to 10 kids in a dance class.
Yeah, I think what we're struggling with as a society, well, just as a species at this point in time, is, where's the truth? Where is the truth of what's being communicated, what's happening? You know, all of this extra stuff is very confusing for many of us. Pretty much, if I go back to what Richard was saying in his masterclass, this idea of that's this unknown, but instead of us leaning into it, it's being pushed upon us.
Yep.
You know.
Yep. Oh. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's difficult. It's difficult for us to make sense, and as this is why I think many of us are struggling, and this is why I've talked about that cyber trauma, is when it's the governments and, you know, the right to say what you want to say causing that trauma. We're in a space and place where it's difficult for people to even manage day to day, let alone that idea of working through their trauma in therapy, or working through the issue of whatever the domestic abuse is, because it's that I'm here and now, and here and now is confusing.
Yep.
Because, you know, there's this engulfing, confusing information. It's just an oversaturation. That's what I want to say. It's not even saturation. It's oversaturation.
Absolutely. Yeah, and this is kind of what's fascinating, is it's like we're on shaky ground. And yet, you know, if we really look at that, it's like, well, which ground are we then going to be going to after this?
Yeah, and of course, you know, when I'm talking online harm, cyber trauma, I'm talking about real things that are uncomfortable. They're overwhelming. You know, I'm not bringing to the conversation comfortable ideas. And of course, we're moving into this space. So, you know, whilst this doesn't sound like a masterclass of me giving any solutions or ideas, so, you know, in comparison to Richard's was very open and about, you know, moving forward with curiosity. I've just kind of closed down the conversation in terms of, and this is why we're struggling. And I'm aware that that's what cyberspace currently is, due to this naivete, this not knowing what it is, or the consequences and what can happen there. And also there's this idea of, what right and privilege do I have to shout and scream to 160,000 followers? I wish I had that many, but, you know, 160,000 followers, that my opinion is the correct one. Because we're into the space of correct versus incorrect. And this is why there's such polarity and polarization out there. And this is why people are struggling so much. Because what I say isn't necessarily the truth. I may need to lean into my curiosity. I may need to learn more. But how do I do that if I don't have access to it?
Exactly. And there's a number of people talking about the fact that, you know, so I've had, you know, simple posts taken down, simple posts, or just like sharing of stuff. And just, you know, if I am musing about some of the things that happened to me during the day with clients, or with, you know, my family or whatever, but more just in a general context. I don't ever share private information, but it's just like, what the hell? Like, if it just has to mention the word COVID, or I just put something up that might actually, I've done my due diligence as much as I can, boom, it banned. You know, just so crazy.
And I mean, this kind of brings me towards that, because I'm just looking at the time as well. This kind of brings me towards that area of, and when we're practicing online, what are we doing to protect that influx of information? What are we doing to protect where that information goes? And just to go back to something that I'd said in the presentation that I gave on Monday, Tuesday, whatever day, I don't know. See, this is where we're at the minute. I don't even know what day I'm on. I think it was Monday. There's this idea of, sometimes we're not competent as users of this digital space to know what's happening with that information. So, for example, how do we protect it? How do we, as I talk about in terms of cybersecurity and data protection, how do we protect it in transit? What happens if that information is then gotten hold of by somebody? What happens in the future to that information? What happens to that person? And, you know, what happens if they then get angry about it and come back to us to explain what they want us to do. You know, there's so much that we don't actually know yet.
Well, I've heard of stories, and just another one, people will not be named here, but a person who's actively campaigning against the virus in Australia, because there are those. She's supposedly now been hacked. And who's that by?
Well, I mean, yeah, the number of cyber criminals that appeared right at, and I said right at the beginning of lockdown, cyber criminals rubbed their hands with glee because they went, oh my goodness, look how many people are going to go online. Look how many people don't know how to protect themselves. Look how many people we can actually infiltrate that we disagree with. Look at how many people we can take down, remove, cancel. You know, it's a cyber criminal's paradise. And of course, we all rushed to go online in a way that more often than not, I saw many of us using this technology rather than saying, hang on a minute, I need to learn about the technology and then use it. Similar to the car. We all jumped in the car in 1900 and, you know, started driving around in it, but didn't realize it had the potential to kill, that it could kill us, that it could hurt, that it could maim, that we needed to be competent when using it, you know. So again, it's technology that we've rushed to use but didn't understand it, and I think there's also something about that's humans all over. That's what we do.
Absolutely. Wow. I feel like with a lot of things with you, Cath, it's very much ... to be continued.
Yeah.
we never quite finish everything, but I think this is almost just how it actually is. And I hope Julie and anyone else listening back on this, because there's a number of people who said, I'm going to be listening to the masterclass, but I just don't, you know, can't come back. And, you know, because a number of people came on Monday or Tuesday. And so they're, you know, I'm going to listen back. And so, Julie, did you have any final questions of Cath before we finish up this evening?
Yeah. Or as is always, you know, as is always, are people going to be crying after this going, oh my God, it's a domain and don't want to understand. It's so scary, you know.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much, Cath, and thanks for being so open to being part of this. It's been brilliant because I think it's really important that we gather together, whether it's small groups, big groups, large groups, just to start new conversations, to be able to interact again around hard topics. And I think you talked about leaning into, and so did Richard, we're like kind of leaning into discomfort, and that's the kind of Brene Brown kind of take on things these days. But like we're really kind of leaning into uncomfortable topics and things where we need to find out, even if we don't want to. I think the veil has been lifted this year on many levels, but it's also then, what do we do now? And it's ... probably.
Yes, there's a lot of learning still to be gained, and you know, and I'm thinking I'm teaching people about the past 10 years. By the time they come to my training, I need to be teaching them about the next 10 years, because I will be at the front and center of that. And of course, as a profession, we're only just learning about what's been for the last 10 to 25 years.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with you. Yeah, to be continued. And I think let's look to the future. That's actually the point of this Vision Conference, which is very fascinating. You finish like that, and we're finishing on that note. That my plan is, I'm actually looking to the future, not necessarily to the past, because past we cannot change it, but we can at least then look to the future and change, and maybe hopefully adapt, be flexible, transform, do all those types of things that we need to do, you know, because humans we are quite adaptable creatures, but we're only adaptable by coming together, merely just transforming ourselves.
Yeah.
So on that note, thank you so much, and that ends the conference. So good way to end, Cath. So you pretty much started and now you've ended it. Awesome. Thanks, Julie, and thanks anyone else who's been listening back to this. And thank you, everyone, to all of the conference presenters, especially Cath and Pip Weeds and everyone else. I'm sure Pip and others who are in the other room tonight will want to listen back to this, hence why we had a bit of a smaller audience tonight. So, that's it. That's a wrap. And thanks to everyone who's taken an interest in what we're doing. Bye, guys.